Hi guys, and welcome back. Today I wanted to just start off with a discussion and our recap with a story. Specifically about land and identity, and I really am I'm sitting back here. We have a couple different fields. I know that's really bougie. We're really bougie Navajo where we have a couple different fields, and we have one up over at our sheep camp, which is our larger field, and then we have one back here because we're teaching the boys how to farm, and teaching them the significance of taking care of stuff every day. And also because in this corn back here that we have, this is particularly we have a heritage breed of red corn that my husband has been trying to really work on over the past couple years. And as we go through this story that I'm going to present, I want you guys to go back to that original PowerPoint that I showed for the beginning of the class that addresses the various layers of traditional ecological knowledge, starting out from worldview perspectives, moving into social, how they build into social institutions, and how those social institutions are based off of land and resource management systems, and then ultimately how everything truly emerges from that practical knowledge, hands-on knowledge. So keep in mind of these various layers as the story is going, because I think this will help to tie everything together in terms of concrete examples of these layers and how they ultimately build into Indigenous identity. Last year was a particularly tough year for us. My entire father side of the family caught COVID, and right during the second wave in the summertime, and I needed something to do. I didn't know what to do because we weren't going to go visit them. We had two young kids. We were in isolation and quarantine, and my husband was the only one, and still is the only one really venturing out. That I was going to start a garden back here. Now, our land here, when we talk about soil, it's not great over at faculty housing. It's high, very high in acid. We have pinon trees and the needles that fall from the different types of spruce trees that are around. It just makes the soil very difficult to work with, especially if it's working with virgin soil and soil that hasn't been farmed before and doesn't have a lot of compost materials in it. But we decided, let's do it anyway. And so we started out a little garden last year, and it really produced very little. But in terms of keeping ourselves grounded, it was, see my grandparents, and then they caught COVID, and it wasn't looking good, and it was a rough couple weeks, and then they ended up passing away. And it was really this little garden that we made for the boys that kept us, at least kept the four of us grounded, because we had responsibilities that we knew we had to take care of. Every day the boys saw this. Every day the boys knew that they can talk to it, that they can sing to it, and teaching those kinds of things helped to not just keep us preoccupied with what was going on, but helped to reintegrate who we were and are as Indigenous peoples, and taking the teachings that we've learned from my grandparents in terms of planting, and they were dry farmers. There was no irrigation system, so when they were gardening, and so learning from that and learning how to talk to them, and learning how to communicate with them through dreams, because it was really after they passed away, there was really no other. I couldn't go over to their house. We couldn't call them anymore. And letting those types of teachings come through to help us improve, this little garden that we have. And the corn was like, it didn't produce anything. I think we didn't even get an ear last year. But it was one of those things that it really kept us grounded, and it kept us reminding us of songs and language and the importance of to still grow. And it also reminded us of the hardship, because I think when people talk about the corn pollen philosophies, any of the corn, right? Because we were talking about how corn kind of unites, almost all of our hemispheric perspectives of Navajo, of Indigenous peoples. People don't talk about the hardship that comes from failed crops. My husband and I, we've had experiences in which we've lost an entire 15-acre fields because frost came early.
and we just happened not to be around in order to get the corn off the ears off the corn. We've had times where there was just no water. We're in the middle. We're 20 years into a drought cycle, and those are the kinds of things that we look towards or ask for in terms of rain, and learning how to work with those types of prayers and those types of understanding grief. And even with my grandparents passing away, that's one of the things that you know we ask for is soft rain to come and show us that they've made it to the next world. And for us, when my grandfather passed away, the rain came. And when the rain came, it was the first time that it rained last summer. And it was just what our fields needed, and it was just what we needed. And it was a sign of communication between worlds and between, you know, understanding that we know who we are based off of the traditional ecological systems that exist. And so I wanted to let you guys know that this is our personal connections. Like, we have all different types of, my husband hunts, and we have fields, and we have livestock. But for me right now, it's this little corn garden that we have here, because if you take a look behind me, and I don't know if you could see it back there, but there's some we have for the first time corn growing. And when we don't stop talking to our corn, they have about 3 weeks to mature. And so every day as we water them, because the rain has stopped again, we talk about, even right here, come on guys, you talk to your corn because they listen to you, and we sing to our corn because they listen to us and they sing back. And I'm really proud of this little field, not just because my boys help us out with it and talk and sing to the corn as well, but because it's starting to produce that even amidst the turmoil that we are facing and the practicalities of the poor soil quality that we're working with over here, it's still growing, it's still fighting, and it's still persisting. And we may not get a large crop, but we will get a couple ears that will allow us to reseed. And that's another thing that we take a look at when we think about these indigenous philosophies and the connection to land, is how do we plan for the future. And so people don't talk about that as well. They talk about planting seeds for the future, but how do you plant seeds? First, you got to grow the crops, and then you got to learn how to not be selfish and save those seeds, and learn how to look for the good seeds to save those seeds. So that's my little story today, taking a look at the significance of land and crops, and how it builds into our identity. Because for us, at least for our family, it speaks volumes. And when crops fail too, it always reminds us, well, how do we look inward, right? That's another thing that people need to always focus in on. How do I look at ourselves first? What's going on around us? Why weren't our crops spared from that drought, or why weren't they spared from that frost? Because sometimes that'll happen. Your neighbor's field will be okay, but yours wasn't. So you always look inward and find out, okay, what's going on in my world that allowed for this to take place? And sometimes you'll find the answer there, and sometimes it's something larger than you. And so those are the things that we look at. So last year, when our crops didn't make in terms of producing a tremendous amount of yields, we looked inwards, and we sat here and we looked at the field, and we said, all right, well, this was more about a learning season. This was our job, to learn and to teach and to kind of reground ourselves, and that's what its purpose was. And it was here. So what do we do with the stalks? And so we hauled them up and we brought them to our sheep. And so those are the kinds of things that we think about. Yes, we did not get seeds to yield, but we do have food. And so how do we utilize that food? So like I said, that's what we take a look at. And when our crops do go well, we take a moment and we pause and we thank everything that we can, and we try to figure out, what are we doing right right? What's going on, right? Because once again, our neighbors' crops may not have made, but ours did. So what are we doing that's right, and how are we being rewarded? And so those are the, once again, just a short slash long story on our understanding of land, and how that connects back to our identity.
So I wanted to take the next couple minutes to discuss, kind of bring together a lot of the discussions that have been taking place on our discussion boards. And first and foremost, I can't thank you guys enough for being so dedicated to critically engaging with the topics, and sometimes they're uncomfortable, and welcoming all of those different types of uncomfortabilities, right? Um, Being okay to sit in that area of discomfort. And so one of the things that I really think that people highlighted out was the purpose and use and intent of land as being this really very physical, visual, sensorial place to remember, right? We can use our land as a way to, and even the ecological systems, the smell of rain, the first snow, as a way to put ourselves back together. So not just have those memories that a lot of you guys were talking about of growing up and who we are, and how things have changed and how things are continuing to persist and the levels of resiliency that you're seeing, but also to remember that we can always put ourselves back together, and this kind of remembering. And so that's one of the things that really stuck out in the conversations that you were having. Another thing is the concept of the sacred mountains, as creating this protective hogan, right? That when we take a look at the sacred mountains, we are actually looking at this space that has been put down to us rather violently, as we talked about in the introduction, to create our home. So we have this destruction that's built in with our safety component. And so when we look at it from like a worldview perspective, it's kind of like, wow, not everything's built from beauty, that there is violence and dismemberment that takes place. But amidst that, right, violence and that dismemberment, there are ways to put us back together. And that is what the Netra and the Nebuchadnezzar is forming for us, right, in those areas. But I also strongly urge you guys to think about land and identity once again. What's your mountain? When you look out the window, what do you see? And because those mountains are really what's going to gauge, for example, ceremonial time periods. Um, I'm thinking, for example, winter ceremonies. For us, winter ceremonies starts as soon as we can see that snow up on the crust of the what they call the backbone of the Cheska Mountains. And so when we take a look at that area, that's where our that's where we come from, right? That's how we design our ceremonial calendar. And so it was very different than, for example, when I grew up in it was the San Francisco peaks, right? That was the mountain that we use as a guidance and as reference. So take a look at your mountains. What mountains are near you? Who's indigenous? If you're not, near the Navajo Nation, whose mountains are you near, and what do they signify? So those are the kinds of things that I always stress for people to be aware with. Another thing that really came up that I really liked is that even though we were talking about, right, this concept of space in terms of mountains and being home and that area, but what about ceremonial space? Right? I thought that was really brilliant that some of you guys really started to delve into that land, because that ceremonial space, right, creates land, and it talks about land, and it builds into our identity. And so thinking about that ceremonial space and how that ceremonial space goes back to, once again, remembering us, putting us back together, trying to establish that equilibrium, that balance that we're always trying to maintain, both in a utopic world and a very practical world as well. So I really appreciated that discuss. We also talked about, right, these binaries. We get so heavily stuck into these binaries. I'm thinking, for example, the discussions of reservation and urban Navajos. Like, how do we resolve that? How do we gauge that? For me, we'll talk a little bit more about that in our decolonization class, because we we started talking about voting, right? And how people who vote off, who live off the reservation, impact the livelihoods of people who do live on the reservation. And so when does it create these conflicts, and then when does it become used to create nothing but boundaries, right, and distinctions and levels of hierarchies? And once again, indigenous peoples, we across, the globe, are hierarchical, right, societies. We don't live in this constant base where everybody's equal, everybody has a value system. And so there are hierarchies in between these areas, but now we've built this supplemental hierarchy in which we have, right, this reservation urban, right, construct that's going on as well. And so, I really enjoyed taking a look at the introductions of those conversations as well. You really were able to articulate them, and make, me think and your classmates think about those spaces as well. And sacred spaces. You guys really started to engage with the concept of sacred space, in terms of like protecting areas. How do we protect ecological systems, because they are so directly, right, integrated into our identities. I'm thinking, for example, even like the San Francisco peaks, and how some people go as far as to the extreme as to say, well, you can't even go up them. Um, eh, but at the same time, there are proper ways to go up these mountains, right? And how to give offerings, and even how to, utilize the recreational arenas that are up there. But the question becomes how, right? And a lot of times people don't know how, so they fall onto, right, this other side of the spectrum, in which it becomes a taboo and you just don't do it, and you use worldviews instead of local land knowledge to actually engage with those particular possible identity creating scenarios. So that's, once again, like I said, just so much food for thought that you guys are bringing forth. And then we started taking a look at, for example, the idea of removal and return from land, and how does that impact us? And questions, for example, what asking yourself, well, was my family involved in this larger Navajo Nation building story of the Long Walk? Or does my family belong to another story that has been silenced by our Navajo, right, the Navajo Nation larger nationalism, right? If we take a look at that from that perspective, how do we fit into this narrative? And so even myself, I started asking questions, and my aunts are asking questions, and these kinds of discussions are really great because they open up opportunities for us to talk to our family members. And so right now my family's all going back, and they're talking to one of our grandmothers, to find out that information, because my mom's generation doesn't know that information. So how do we find that out? Let's start talking and start building back up our family histories. And it's, once again, goes back to that concept of remembering, right? We, how do we continue to put our family histories back in line in those arenas? And I think, one of you guys really brought up this component about how Navajos kind of get really, because we are on our land base, right? That guilt complex, like why should we feel guilty in that component? The long walk, even that separation, I think about it in terms of, I don't want to say blessing because sometimes that gets misconstrued, but if you think about the long walk, compared to, for example, what was going on with the Trail of Tears and the civilized tribes that were separated, right? They were separated and they were sent to different reservations throughout the Midwest and the East Coast. They weren't kept in one conglomerate. And so that helped to break down language, break down culture, break down ecological knowledge systems, break down, right, all of those areas, those arenas, those psychological, social, government, right? Those were all broken down. That wasn't necessarily the case with the Navajo people, right? We traveled as a group in several different trails and in different packs. But we were able to maintain those areas, right? The psychological mentalities and strength and resiliencies, even governance systems, and language, of course, and the same thing with our return back. So we have to think about those kinds of comparisons when we look at, for example, all the different long walks that have taken place across the United States and Canada as well.
And we didn't even really get a chance to delve into concepts, for example, of growing up on the reservation or not growing up on the reservation, but wanting to return. And where is that particular space? Where do individuals who have gone off the reservation for educational endeavors or in pursuits of employment and now are looking for space to return back home, what are the complications of that? We haven't had an opportunity to explore that, but that is also something that we can take a look at. And along those lines, right, there's the question of, well, how do we, what is stewardship? How is stewardship different, for example, from home site lease process and procedures? And how does that once again, how do both of those systems tie back into our identities? So there's just so much room for us to continue to expand these conversations. And I do urge you guys to continue our discussion posts that we already do have going on our forums. And then last but not least, we had the opportunity to really engage with the concept of land acknowledgements, which is this phenomena that's taking place in which we are now acknowledging indigenous peoples and indigenous lands. But the question does come up in terms of, federally acknowledged tribes, non-federally acknowledged tribes. What does a land not acknowledgement mean? Does it mean anything to indigenous peoples? And so those are some really great discussions, once again, that you guys were able to hold. So I wanted to thank you guys for really engaging with this particular section, and I look forward to engaging with this discussion later. If you guys are interested in exploring these particular topics in the future, I will be teaching a 399 class probably in the spring on traditional ecological systems. So we'll be combing through a lot of these topics in depth throughout a 16-week period starting in January. So I hope that you guys will be interested in joining me, and I will see you in our next discussion, which will be about art and culture.